Hi, I'm Pastor Josiah Black from Peru First Baptist Church, and this is our ongoing video Bible study where we dive into a little scripture, usually short passages at a time, and we work on trying to understand what they mean. Right now, we're in the midst of a study of the book of Habakkuk. We're pretty early on, still in chapter 1. So I want to encourage you, if you're just jumping in now, you're more than welcome to watch this video, but I suggest you watch the Habakkuk introduction and the first video about chapter 1 so that you're caught up before you really dive in. So it's just a suggestion. You can jump in now if you want to, but today we're going to look at a slightly larger passage. And the reason being that when I was going through this and trying to break these down, I think this next part, it's going to be best if we take it all as one. Because if we try to split it into two, we're going to end up looking at some of the same ideas over and over again, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think it would be better to just move us through and understand this part of it and continue on with the narrative of Habakkuk. So if you'll recall, last week when we looked at verses 1 through 4, Habakkuk brought a complaint to the Lord about what was going on in the land around him. And here is the Lord's answer. So this is verses 5 through 11. Let me go ahead and read it, and then we'll start working on breaking it down. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are feared and dreaded people, and they are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. So that's Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 5 through 11, and that is strangely God's answer to Habakkuk. Because remember, Habakkuk was talking about things he was seeing in his own land. Just to make that clear, he was talking about the things that were going on immediately around him. And God goes on to look at this big outside of just Babylon problem. So that's kind of his response. So it's kind of strange. God almost answers Habakkuk by presenting him with a bigger problem. One thing that I found interesting as I sort of studied this is that there are some connections that are sort of implied between these two things in the original language. So verbs in Hebrew, words in Hebrew, are sometimes interchangeable depending on the context, which is why translation is such hard work and requires a lot of expertise, and why I still require so many resources when I'm looking at language and things like that, because to really understand Hebrew would take a lifetime, especially when you're not from that culture and that context, especially ancient Hebrew, which does not have all the helps that modern Hebrew does. They're different languages in a lot of ways. So all that to say, one thing that I found very interesting that one of the commentaries I was looking at pointed out is this. There are linguistic parallels between verses 1-3, which is something Habakkuk says, and verses 1-5, which is something God says. So 1-3 reads like this. This is part of Habakkuk's original complaint to the Lord. It says, why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you make me see injustice? The verb there is ra'ah. And why do you tolerate wrong? The verb there for tolerate is nabat, okay? If we jump down to 1-5, where God begins his answers, he says, look at the nations, ra'ah, that's the same verb, look at the nations, ra'ah, and watch, nabat. So in this case, tolerate and watch are essentially the same verb. They're the same concept. And so God is, in picking up his answer to Habakkuk's question, he's using two of the same verbs that Habakkuk used, and that's intended as a signal to the reader that God has heard and understood Habakkuk's question, and his answer is connected to and relevant to what Habakkuk is asking, okay? So for us, it can seem a little disjointed, right? If we just read this flat, we would see Habakkuk asking very specifically about things going on around him, and we would see God answering about things that Babylon was seemingly doing out in the world at large. And we know Babylon's coming their way, right? But but he's talking about what's going on out there because it hasn't necessarily happened to Habakkuk yet. So this is intended as a signal that God is listening, God is paying attention to them. So when he says, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, he's telling Habakkuk, I hear your question, and I'm using the same words you use to acknowledge that. So this is relevant, this is connected, even if we don't necessarily see the connection. And we're not going to get the satisfaction of fully understanding everything God's trying to communicate. We're also not going to get the satisfaction, I think, in this particular lesson of understanding even a little what God's trying to communicate, because right now it's still fuzzy to Habakkuk, so it should still be fuzzy to us to some degree. But let's go on. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told, which is really the setup in verse 5 for verse 6, which is him saying, I am raising up the Babylonians, the ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings that not their own. Now, this is significant because it's God saying, even though the Babylonians are not my people, I am using them. I have raised them up. This thing they're doing in the world, this destruction, this disruption, this carrying people away, I am allowing that to happen. I have caused that to happen. They are doing work that I want them to do in one way or another. Now, this is not God signing off morally on the Babylonians. In fact, he goes on, a good portion of our passage today is how awful they are, but he is still using them for their purposes. We have to understand a difference there between God using them for his purposes, using something negative for his purposes. There's a difference between that and God condoning what they're doing and the way they're doing it, which we might struggle to see, but it's there. You know, there's a difference there. There's a distinction there. So they sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. So I want to take that big chunk because this is intended as both a condemnation of who the Babylonians are, and it's intended also to contrast them to God's people, to the people God is trying to raise up, okay? God is using these folks, and I think what we're going to find is that part of the reason God's showing or trying to reveal this to Habakkuk is he needs to understand what happens in the world when God's people aren't present like they're supposed to be. That's not him laying this at their feet. It's just that this is what it looks like when people are left to their own devices, when people do not submit themselves to God. This is what you get, is this particular group of people. So they are feared and dreaded. They are a law to themselves. Now that's a powerful statement there, because as we know, Hebrew society, Israelite society was oriented, or was supposed to be oriented, around covenant faithfulness to God, which was demonstrated by living lives according to the law God had given them. Okay, so we're supposed to be faithful to God, and the way they demonstrated and lived and worked out that faith was through faithfulness to the law. Even when they fell short, participating in the sacrificial system, doing all the things they needed to do to essentially be the people of God in the best way they could at this particular time in history. So to call the Babylonians a law unto themselves, a law to themselves, is significant for a lot of reasons, but mainly because he's, again, creating this contrast. God is contrasting these people to what his people of the law are supposed to be. They promote their own honor instead of promoting the honor of God. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallop headlong. Horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swooping to devour. So this is significant because the Babylonians were a military force to be reckoned with in this region at the time. Nebuchadnezzar, who led these people, was famous for how quickly and rapidly he would attack, he would move. He would chase people down. It was warfare, aggressive and active in a way that these people had not seen before. And keep in mind that Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, had rolled through the Assyrians and the Egyptians and were absolutely unchallengeable at this particular point in history. When God sort of raised them up, as the Bible says, they were not, it was bad. If the Babylonians showed up in your front door, you were probably going to lose, both tactically and in terms of numbers. They were a fierce and terrible army. And that's what these comparisons are supposed to capture. This comparison with leopards, with wolves, with eagles. These are all fierce creatures, right? And that's what he's trying to, these are wild and fierce people who do what they do very well. The hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. You ever see a wind in the desert? It picks up a great deal of sand. Side note, someone is now vacuuming in the hallway outside. So I'm hoping that that doesn't get picked up too badly on this. I'm going to keep going, and I'm sorry if this is a little background noise. So, all right, actually, I'm going to pause the recording, and we're going to pick back up in just a minute. All right, we're back. Sorry about that. I don't know how loud it was coming through in the recording, but it was coming through pretty loud for me. So I did not want to just continue and push through and have it not work well for us. So we were just finishing up talking about how God was comparing the Babylonians to all these various animals because of their fierceness and how quickly and viciously they tended to attack. Let's go on to verse 10. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. So imagine that you were living in a walled city and you feel very, very secure. And yeah, there are siege weapons and things like that armies do sometimes use, but they still have to reckon with things like gates and walls, right? Like they can't just they have to knock down a gate, but even then you've got them on a gate. And then imagine this army shows up, and instead of just knocking your gate down, they build ramps so that they can just walk right over your walls. Pretty intimidating. That's pretty unsettling for people of this time. The point of all of this is the Babylonians are terrible, and they're good at what they do, and what they do is destroying, conquering, capturing people. The desert wind comparison, where it talks about, I think this was right where I interrupted my thought earlier. The desert wind comparison, they talk about gathering prisoners like sand. This may be one that misses a little for us unless you've spent some time in a desert region. But when the wind really kicks up, maybe you've seen footage of big wind storms, things like that in Iraq or in other places where there's sand that gets picked up or dirt that gets picked up. Sometimes this happens in the Western United States, in Arizona and in West Texas. A lot of these big wind storms that pick up dust. In the desert, they pick up sand, right? And what it's saying is they gather prisoners like sand, which is supposed to imply they take all kinds of prisoners, so many prisoners that are so plentiful and so many that it's impossible to count or number them. That's what it's trying to say with this. Very last verse, they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. So this is the cap of God's sort of first response to Habakkuk, when Habakkuk calls out the woes that are going on around him. God closes it with an acknowledgement that these people, these Babylonians that have been raised up and that are conquering people, they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. So he's making it clear that he's raised them up, but these are not his people. He's not telling Habakkuk, hey, the Babylonians, I'm their God now. These are the bad guys. These are bad people from God's perspective, people who do not worship him, people who have not been redeemed into any kind of relationship with Yahweh, and they worship more than anything their own strength. And that's broadly true, very true of what we know about the Babylonians in general. A lot of their gods were warlike gods, and the highest cultural reality for them was the stronger you are, the more valuable you are. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. Now, you don't want to be described by God as a guilty person whose own strength is their God. That is counter to everything God has called his people to be. So God's making it clear that he's raised these people up, that they're doing this thing, but they aren't his people, which is reasonable to be confused by. Like, we don't, and that's what I was saying earlier, where we're not going to get a satisfactory answer. This is a confusing passage, and it doesn't make super clear what God's plan and intent is with all of this. I think we're going to have to stick with it a while longer to really understand what God's trying to communicate here. We'll circle back around later if we don't get there organically. I'll do a wrap up at some point that says, hey, in case we didn't put all these pieces together, here's what God was doing. Here's why he raised up Babylon, at least to the best of our ability to understand. Because obviously we're not going to understand fully the mind of God, but I think he gives us a lot. So we'll get into that more in future ones, both as we analyze more scripture, and then if we don't get there sort of organically, I'll share the best ideas we've got about it, if that makes sense. So thanks as always for joining. Sorry, I know this one was a little longer than normal, but I wanted to get us into and through this section. And I hope you'll agree that breaking them up would not have worked as well. But anyway, thanks so much for joining, and I'll catch you on the next one.